Well, welcome again to our class on Mark. Before we get into the Bible, just pray that everybody's Easter was as good as possible. And I hope you had an opportunity to see either the Good Friday service or the weekend Easter service, either one. They're both really good. I didn't have a thing to do with either one of them. I'm just going to put it out there. I didn't, but I was really proud of all of our people, and I felt they were moving and appropriate for the times, and it's an opportunity to think about what is really the most important day in the history of the world, which is the resurrection of Jesus. I also want to thank so many of you for sending kind words to me about doing this class and continuing on. It's nice to hear that this is helpful, and I'm honored that I get to do this. And so we'll just keep going like this until the day that we get the word that we can all meet again. That'll be a great day, I'm sure. And that today we're going to cover the first 9 verses of chapter 4. Usually when we get to a new chapter, we celebrate because it takes so long to get from one chapter to the next. And so I guess we can all be, hey, we're in chapter 4. What do you know? And so let me pray for us, and then we'll read that passage, and then we'll get going. Lord, I am thankful for your presence, thankful for the assurance that you are with us no matter what the circumstances of our lives may be. Thank you for the truth of the resurrection of your Son. His death and resurrection have changed the entire tenor of the history of the world, and at the same time, it's also changed the direction of our own individual eternal lives, and so we thank you for that. I pray that what we say and do in this time together, looking at your word, will honor you and draw us closer to you, and will show us in a new and deeper way how much you love us. So I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're in chapter 4 in Mark, and I'm going to read the first 9 verses. And it says this: Once again, Jesus began teaching by the lakeshore. A very large crowd soon gathered around him, so he got into a boat. Then he sat in the boat while all the people remained on the shore, and he taught them by telling many stories in the form of parables, such as this one. Listen, a farmer went out to plant some seed. As he scattered it across his field, some of the seed fell on a footpath, and the birds came and ate it. Other seed fell on the shallow soil with underlying rock. The seed sprouted quickly because the soil was shallow, but the plant soon wilted under the hot sun since it didn't have deep roots, and it died. Other seed fell among the thorns that grew up and choked out the tender plants, so they produced no grain. Still other seeds fell on the fertile soil, and they sprouted and grew and produced a crop that was 30, 60, and even 100 times as much as had been planted. And then he said, anyone who has ears should listen and understand. Okay, this is chapter 4, and it begins with these 2 words. Now, it says in our NLT translation, it says once again, but the literal Greek just goes and again. And this and again is a reference, it must be a reference back to the earlier teaching of Jesus by the seaside or by the Sea of Galilee, back in the 2nd chapter, about verse 9 or something like that. It talks about Jesus teaching by the shore. And this isn't to say that these are the only times that Jesus has taught. In fact, Mark has stressed Jesus' teaching throughout everything that we've looked at so far. It's just that he hasn't recorded any of Jesus' teaching yet. And this is the second teaching moment that he makes a point about. And this one may well have taken place in the exact same location as the first time that Jesus taught. And so Mark mentions it specifically. There is a bay in Capernaum where it would be possible, according to John Walton, who's like the man when it comes to Old Testament contextual things. He mentions it in a number of his books, and what he says is there's a bay near Capernaum where you could actually stand in the water and teach up to about 7,000 people from a boat. In fact, this cove is called Sowers Cove today because it is believed to be the location of this teaching in particular. And Mark tells us that a large crowd had gathered or assembled. The word is sunagetai. Sunagetai simply means a gathering or an assembly of people. Interestingly, it only exists when they're gathered. But guess where that word also gives us the word synagogue. And so this is a hint to the gathering of the Jewish people. And it says that the crowd is so large that Jesus had to get into a boat. And he had to teach from the water. And in the earlier story about Jesus teaching near the sea, Jesus had just told him to get a boat ready in case people shoved him into the water. He wanted to be able to get into it if there was trouble from people pushing on him. And they mostly were pushing on him because they wanted to touch him to get healing from him. But this time, he chooses to start his teaching from the water. And much is made of two things about this. Well, really, it's three things. One, they make a big deal about. I'll talk about it first, and I don't think it's all that important. But the scholars tend to emphasize Jesus' acoustical knowledge. Like he had some kind of special knowledge about the fact that if you go out onto water and talk, that it spreads across the water and people can hear it better than if you're standing on the shore and talking. But the truth is that ancient people generally knew about this stuff. In fact, they had to know a whole heck of a lot more about acoustical things because they didn't have microphones and PA systems and anything like that. So every time they were talking in the raw nature. And so they had figured out a lot of ways to be heard. So this thing about Jesus talking on water, across water to people would have been just generally known. I don't think that that's all that special. But the second thing that people speak to is the fact that the Greek tells us very specifically that he got into a boat and he sat down to teach. That sitting down was the expected position of a Jewish teacher. For Jesus to have a large gathering of people and yet still to sit down as he's speaking to them was a hint that he thought of himself as a rabbi, somebody who was going to speak to people and they needed to listen to him. Now, how many people were in that boat with him, we don't know. But I just have to say, I'm sure he wasn't alone. You know, remember, these boats were working boats. It's not going to be too long before Jesus falls asleep in the back of one of these boats, and all 12 of the other disciples are in the boat with him. These are pretty good-sized boats. And so I'm sure he was out there in the water, sitting down, and behind him were some other people. We want to picture that as opposed to Jesus sitting at the front end of a little rowboat on the shore. It's just not what it probably was. And a third thing that I think is somewhat overblown, but scholars do talk about it, but it is clearly in the Greek, it says that Jesus sat on the sea. Now, this use of the preposition on is often regarded in metaphorical terms, especially due to the fact that Jesus is about to give a very highly metaphorical parable to the people. And so people go crazy with this, with Jesus sitting on the sea, and especially like medieval theologians and people like that, they would go on and on about Jesus was sitting on the sea, and this shows us that he has mastery over the chaos of the natural world. And I get that. These scholars feel that even the slight mention of the position of Jesus is far bigger than the moment probably would normally be considered. I think to take the use of one particular preposition as a sign of something massive, that this Jesus on the sea in a boat is supposed to imply that he's in charge of all nature. I don't think anybody would have gotten it at the time. Now, we do know that later on, he is going to walk on the water, same word. But I don't believe that Mark was making a grand existential point with the use of this one preposition here. The point of Jesus' mastery is true. He does control all of nature. I just think that some scholars are trying to make a bigger point here than is necessary. But with all of that, it says, Mark says to us that Jesus taught the crowd, it says, in many parables. And then he says that in his teaching, he said this. And goes on to give us this one parable. Now, we have to remember, I think I talked about it last week, but the word parable had a specific meaning in Greek. The definition was fairly limited. A parable was a story that comes from real life. It's a made-up narrative, but that is rooted in the real experience of living that always ends up with a moral lesson. And Jesus' teaching was certainly not limited to that definition. In fact, that's not even what we get in this parable. The Jewish concept of a mashal, which is the word from Hebrew that gets translated as parable, a mashal was far wider and didn't necessarily contain that given moral end. There were multiple kinds of sayings and teachings that fell under this mashal definition. I know I talked about this before, but we have to remember this because we're going to bump into this word parable, and Jesus is going to say all kinds of different things, speak in all kinds of ways, and they're all going to get called parables. It's just that that's the only Greek word that we have to translate what is a bigger concept. And the truth is that the reason that Hebrew teachers had so many choices under their title of mashal was because they were really trying to get people to think about things and discuss things. They weren't trying to impose a moral reality or truth onto a crowd. They generally were trying to get them to trying to get their people to work their way through a story or a riddle, and to see how that story or riddle might apply to their own lives or the lives of the community. Jesus' use of parables was closer to this idea, wide open, let's talk in broad ways. I'll give you something to think about, and let's see what we come up with. He wasn't leading up to one specific moral end when he was teaching. Again, he wanted to engender thought and discussion, and we're going to talk about this later. But right now, we have to keep in mind that we have to approach the parables this way. And these parables are going to lead us to multiple applications. And here's the big point. The big point is that the application often tends to lean into the context of the listener. What is going on in their life will change the meaning of what Jesus says, as opposed to someone else who hears the same story. They will think about it and come to different conclusions about what Jesus is trying to say. Jesus makes it clear right at the beginning, though, that he fully expects this crowd. And remember, anytime we talk about the crowd, we're talking about a group of unpredictable people whose allegiance is unknown at any given moment. He is telling them to listen. And we know this because he begins with two words right at the beginning here that are not found together. I don't think these two words are found together anywhere else in the New Testament. He says, listen, and then he says, behold. He puts them together. Listen, which is an imperative. The word is akuete. It's like, hear ye, or listen up. It's like that kind of word. Now, some scholars point out that this word is actually the first word in the Greek form of the Shema, which is the big, important Jewish saying, I guess. The Shema was, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And it was like the most important general public saying in the Jewish world, the Shema. And the scholars will say, well, Jesus opens up with akuete, and everybody thinks he's going to say the Shema. But then he says something else. He goes, behold, or take note, or this is really important. He says something like that, and it would take them off guard a little bit. I don't know, maybe Jesus was He's clearly making a point that everybody better listen to him carefully, but I don't know that he was trying to reference the Shema. But he does say, listen up and take note. I think it's just that he wants everybody to know that what he's about to say is really important. You better listen. He wants everybody awake, and he wants everybody paying attention. Now, another note before we look at the parable itself, it says that I want us to remember that Jesus has two audiences when he starts to speak right here and give this parable. He has two primary audiences. One is his disciples, and the other is the crowd. Now, each audience had a different need from Jesus and different intention, really. The disciples needed to be certain that they were making a good choice in following Jesus. We have to remember that up until we've gotten to this point in the story, a lot of people have followed Jesus, but they all have something they want from him. But we've also got Jesus' own family who think he's out of his mind. And we've got people who are religious people who think he's working for the devil. And so these 12 men needed to hear something that gave them confidence that their following him was the right thing to do. They needed that confidence in the moment as he starts to teach. And then the crowd needed to hear something that would lead them beyond what I would call their self-centered response to Jesus' action. Most of the people were there. They were listening to him, but what they wanted from him was they wanted him to heal their illnesses. They wanted something from him for themselves. And Jesus wanted them to listen up and to take note, because what he was about to say was going to be the words of God. Words that could move their lives into a place of real fruitfulness. And it's interesting because if we look at this carefully, this parable, this is pretty much what Jesus delivers to both audiences. He's going to bring confidence to the disciples. He's going to let them know that they made a really good decision when they decided to take him up on it and to follow him. And then his other words are going to force people to think in a different way about who Jesus is. What's he talking about? And maybe they'll come to a decision that says, he's saying stuff that's really important. We need to listen more to him. Well, anyway, the story begins by telling us that there was a sower who went out to sow. It says farmer here. That's okay in the NLT, but it's a sower went out to sow. And I have no idea why this parable is always called the parable of the sower, or why they would call that bay the sower bay or anything, because the sower plays almost no part in this story. The story is about seed and soil. But that's okay. Now, the way they did this was that most farmers then, they would sow their seed first, and then they would plow it in. Now, there is some record of some occasional farmers plowing first and then sowing, but almost everybody did it the other way around. They have a big bag that they would wear over their shoulder, and they would just walk along and broadcast the seed like this. And you can imagine if you're sowing, and once they were done sowing it, they would then plow it in so that it would be under the soil and it could grow out of it. And you can imagine that broadcasting seed in this way made it possible for seed to go all over the place. It could get caught in the wind. It could get thrown into a direction that was get it out of the field or into another place. And this is what we see. It would not be unexpected for seed to get into odd places. Now, the first place that it says that it went, it's scattered. It says he scattered it across the field, and some fell on a footpath, and the birds came and ate it. Now, footpaths through fields were normal. Footpaths either ran through the fields or they ran right along the edges. And people stayed on these footpaths and they walked them. They were always paths that were the shortest distance from one place to another, and everybody walked on these footpaths. And you can imagine how packed down they get. I know that we lived, and I've said this 1,000 times to those of you who've been in my classes, but Jennifer and I lived in England for 2 years, and we've also been back many, many times, and everywhere in Great Britain are what are called public footpaths, and they go right straight through fields. And you can tell where the people walk on them, and it doesn't matter what's going on in that field. They have to keep it open for people to walk on it. Now here's the deal. If enough people walk on a path over and over and over, it doesn't matter. Remember, they're not plowing with tractors. They might have an oxen, probably an oxen, or maybe a donkey. They didn't use horses. Pulling a plow. When they hit the path, it's so packed down, it's not going to turn it over anyway. So it's going to bounce over it. And so the situation was well known to people. Any seed landing on the footpath would be ripe for birds to eat it. Now, we're going to talk about birds later, but I just want you to know that birds generally are a bad thing as omens or metaphorical images in the Bible. But they would know that, the people would have known that if you threw seed on a hard pathway, the birds would probably come in and get it. And that was easy for them to understand. And one other thing I want to tell you. Weirdly, all of the Greek use of, every time it says seeds, if you look, it says some seeds fell here and there. In the Greek, they're all in the singular. Why, I do not know. Some people make a big deal about this because what ends up happening is that there are only 6 seeds that get planted, 3 that get planted that don't produce fruit, and then 3 that produce fruit. And they're all in the singular. I'm just going to say I recognize this incongruity. If you run into somebody who's preaching a sermon and they start going on about the singular seeds, that's fine. They're right with the Greek, but I just think it's just wrong to focus on that as singular. This is an image that comes out of real life, and there's not a farmer on the planet who would go out in the field with 6 seeds and throw 1 here and 1 there and 1. I mean, I'm just going to put it out there, okay? Well, anyway, we got a picture of a farmer doing his job, and he's thrown some on a pathway. It's not going to grow. And then we get to the next guy that says that he planted his seed, the seeds fell on what it really literally says is rocky place. This would be just soil that was very thin, had a lot of rock underneath it. I live in a place like that. Every year, rocks just come up. Apparently where I live, it used to be a gravel pit. Every year, my lawn is full of rocks. And this seed does take root. It begins to grow. But then the soil is so shallow that when the sun comes out and beat down on it, it can't live in that, and it dies. Jesus says these plants, or it literally says this plant, he's singular there as well. It says when the sun comes out and the heat hits it, it causes it to wither because it doesn't have any roots, or that its roots aren't strong enough to keep the plants alive. This too would have been understandable because soil often had a lot of rock in it in that part of the world. Other seeds were planted where thorns were growing. Now there's been a lot of work done on trying to figure out what kind of thorn plant this was. Everybody wants to know what the plant was. Can I just say that all that work has been to little success. The plant is not identified here. The point is that the seed does germinate, and it actually grows to full length, at full height. But because it's growing with other plants, all of its energy is put into just growing up, and it never produces any fruit. It never produces any seeds. In other words, it grows, but it gives no return due to the overshadowing of the thorn plants or the root mixing. This is why people want to know what kind of plant it is, because they want to know what causes it. But the truth is, it could be any of this stuff. The bottom point is this: it doesn't have any fruit. In fact, 3 places or 3 different spaces of seeds have all failed to do what the farmer purposed. The final seed, it says, falls on good soil, and it grows and it produces well. These numbers 30, 60, and 100 are not astronomical numbers. In fact, the truth is the average return on one seed in the first century farming in Palestine was between 7.5 and 10 times, which means 10 heads of grain for one seed. But the kind of harvest here that Jesus talks about wasn't unheard of. 100 seeds of grain for each seed planted would have been exceptional, but it wasn't outside of reason. In all the apocalyptic literature, in the tradition of talking about what it's going to be like in the harvest of the coming of the kingdom of God, the numbers are, and this is the stuff people would have been reading, by the way, at that time. The numbers are like one seed gives you 1 million seed plants. It's like it's off the charts. What Jesus does is he keeps it into something that could be expected in the best of times. That's important, the best of times. The story telling ends with no explanation, and we're left to ask, what might this mean? Now, the problem is that it's impossible for us to get here and go, what does this mean, without going to the fact that in just a couple of verses, Jesus is going to tell us what it means. We have a really hard time not going there. And we also have centuries of preachers telling us what this is all about, saying what it is. But the truth is that we need to take the parable as it is because this is the way the disciples and the crowd would have heard it. We must remind ourselves again that there are two audiences, the disciples and the crowd, and we as readers, we must either say, am I a disciple? Am I in need of assurance that it's worth following Jesus? There's wisdom in that. Or am I like somebody in the crowd who hasn't really committed all the way to Jesus? And do I need to listen more carefully to what he says? This is where we need to be right now before we have an explanation. If I'm a disciple, then I have to see that this tale, in the context of all that has been happening up to this point in this story, it tells the disciples, yes, their decision to follow Jesus is a good one. But what they need to think about is this: the 3 out of 4 times people are going to reject it. We may have, as disciples of Jesus, followed him and just figured that everybody's going to follow him like we are. And the truth is that it's going to be very different than that. There are going to be plenty of people out there who don't see Jesus as the one who's going to bring fruitfulness to their lives. And there are multiple ways for people not to listen to Jesus. The parable says directly that not all who listen will hear the same thing. Not all will take note of the fruitful possibilities in the good news of Jesus. Not all will respond with the same joy as we as disciples do. For the crowd, the point is simply, hey, this thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but he said to listen to it and think about it and try to consider what possibilities may come from this. Jesus doesn't say where he assumes the crowd is with regards to his message. He simply says, listen carefully. He says, if you have ears to hear, listen, pay attention in the moment. He's really saying there is so much working against you, catching on to what I'm trying to say, that you need to stop and pay attention. Now, how much the crowd understood isn't said. The story itself was, though, meant to spur thought and discussion. The crowd would have had some notion of seed being something that they could listen to and take in. The metaphor wasn't new. Rabbis had used it before. Jesus was talking in a way that they would have heard. But the parable itself doesn't give us or the crowd enough information to make the meaning clear. And that's okay. Jesus' point was to make them wonder, to bring them back to listen, to help them put form to the most important of questions. And as we will soon see, even as Jesus is trying to get the disciples to be comfortable with the kinds of results that come from his teaching out among the many people that are listening, we're going to come to see they didn't even get it themselves. The disciples didn't get it. So we can't expect too much out of the crowd. Now we're going to stop right there, because next week we're going to go on to, and the next 3 verses I'm just going to say are probably the 3 most debated verses in all the New Testament. There are positions on what these next verses say that run from the uber reformed, all the way to people who think that this is so wacky that Mark probably didn't write it and Jesus never said it. And we'll look at these controversies in a bit, but I must say that I have never seen so much parsing of every single detail possible in any place in the Scripture. We'll get to that next week, but my hope is that we can take the core of what is being said coming up, of what we've already heard, and we can apply it to what Jesus is saying next, and we'll just take all the confusion out of it. But before I go, I want to just say this one thing. Jesus' intention is never to leave us confused. He always wants us to know that God is reaching out to us because he has a life for us that is worth living. Okay, thanks. I'll see you next week.